Hello, lovely people of the internet. I'm the chosen Epicurus, and today we're going to be breaking down 5 key points from the first episode of Unorthodox and discussing whether or not they're true. In case you're wondering what's my authority to be talking about that subject, I was brought up as an ultra-Orthodox person. So I'm an ex-orthodox, that's my point of reference. So the first thing that I would like to break down today is the language that is being used throughout the series. So we see Esti speaking to her family and to other members of her community in Yiddish. That brings up the question, do all ultra-Orthodox Jews speak Yiddish? And the simple answer to the question would be no, but it's still correct in the series. Not to complicate things too much. Since the Jews went into exile after the first temple of Judea that was destroyed, they stopped using Hebrew as their everyday language. And the most common reason that I find for it in Hebrew literature is the fact that they were suddenly surrounded by pagans and they didn't want to use the holy names of God and other holy words of the Hebrew language near pagan gods. That led to this very interesting phenomena that Jewish people in the diaspora developed their own languages. So we see Jews all the way in Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan speaking their own version of Persian mixed with Hebrew and Aramaic, and we see Jews in Kurdistan speaking only Aramaic. We see Jews in most of Europe speaking an old version of German called Yiddish, and we see Jews on the Maghreb and other Muslim countries either speaking Jewish Arabic or speaking Ladino. It led to the fact that Hebrew only became a language of scriptures and letters, so if one Jewish community wanted to communicate with another Jewish community, no matter where they were in the world, they would send them a letter in Hebrew. But if two Jewish people in Germany or Poland or Lithuania met on the street, they would speak to each other in Yiddish. If two Jewish people in Turkey met on the street and had a conversation, they would most likely speak in Ladino. But that changed, at least in the last 100 years. So when the idea of Zionism was brought up, the Hebrew language was renewed and revived. So from being this only text language that is used in letters and in writings, it started being used as an everyday language. And it rose a lot of debate within Orthodox communities around the world. Some Orthodox people, mostly non-ultra-Orthodox, accepted Zionism as part of the religion, and they immediately warmly embraced Hebrew as their language. Other Orthodox communities do not recognize Zionism as a holy movement, but they were still willing to tolerate the usage of Hebrew. So at first, those kind of communities were speaking amongst themselves in Yiddish, but if, let's say, they would go into another town or city where other people would speak Hebrew, they were willing to use Hebrew. And the last community that we're going to be talking about is the Orthodox community that completely refrained from recognizing any sort of Zionism. They believed, and still believe to the day, that Zionism is heresy, and they would never use modern Hebrew and won't be speaking Hebrew every day. So the Satmar community belongs to the third group. They're one of the groups that never recognized the state of Israel, never recognized Zionism, and was never willing to embrace the Hebrew language. Now, the second community is the community that I was brought up in. So I was brought up in a society that didn't necessarily embrace Zionism as a religious movement, and they didn't believe that Zionism is a good thing. We never celebrated Independence Day, no one that I knew went to the Israeli military. I grew up in this group that was willing to tolerate Israel, but nothing more. So in that group, Yiddish was used until Jews from the Maghreb and other Sephardi Jews, such as Yemenite Jews and later on Ethiopian Jews, started being brought up into Israel because anti-Semitism rose in the countries that they lived in. And when that happened, my community stopped using Yiddish as their primary language because people would be sitting in class and not understanding what the teacher is saying. I remember my mom telling us when I was a kid how frustrating it was to sit in class and suddenly the teacher would switch into Yiddish and say a joke, and my mom wouldn't understand what the teacher was saying. So in order to avoid that problem, they switched into modern day Hebrew. So me being brought up in Israel, I spoke modern Hebrew. I didn't have like secular Israeli slangs or anything like that, but I could still fully communicate with secular Israelis. So no, not all ultra-Orthodox Jews speak Yiddish, only some of them do, and some of them until today. So we still have neighborhoods in the city where I grew up that people don't speak modern Hebrew. We have a lot of neighborhoods in Jerusalem where people don't speak modern Hebrew, and we also have a very large community in New York of Jewish ultra-Orthodox people who don't speak any Hebrew. So in a sense, in the series, it was accurate, the fact that Esti and her family members speak Yiddish, but it's not the automatic answer for all ultra-Orthodox communities. The second key point that I would like to discuss today is the fact that Esti is an orphan and how it influences the match that she received. And at some point in the series that her aunt is referring to her as Nebech, which is poor one, because she's orphaned, and Esti is like, I'm not orphaned.
לא מן warten bis die Shapiros will masken sind zum Schiedich. Sie sei Säume nebich. Ich bin nicht keine Säume.
The way courting, if you can even call it courting, in the ultra-Orthodox community is a very complex because it varies very dramatically from one community to another. So you get some communities like Esti's community where you don't really meet the person that you're going to be getting married to except for those 20 minutes that we see in the show. Every person in the ultra-Orthodox community, and that's true for all of them, has a system point attached to them. Now, it's not a literal system of points, but this system of points exists, and it talks about how good of a student you are, how nice looking you are, how tall you are, how short you are you fat, are you skinny, how is your family like, do you come from a healthy family, so are your parents married, or do you come from a broken family, so are your parents divorced, how modest you are, do you have like important people in your family lineage. A matchmaker is assigned to you and she is evaluating your points and the other person's points, and according to that she's gonna match you up. So if you're a really good girl and you don't have too many bad points attached to you, you're gonna get someone who is from a good family and also like good looking and with important people in the family lineage, etc., etc. Then if you belong to Esti's community, you would only meet them for 20 minutes, decide whether or not you want to get engaged on the basis of that brief encounter, be engaged for a whole year, and a year later get married. I had neighbors that got married that way. I personally know people who got married that way. So yeah, it's true and it's very unfortunate. But you also have courting in my community, which is, it works on the same point basis, but you actually get to meet the person usually in other people's houses. So a family friend would give their living room for that occasion and you would meet there the person. You can meet up to like 5 times is acceptable in the community that I come from. You meet, you talk, you have a discussion, you get engaged, and usually about 2 months later or 3 months maximum you get married. You can meet once in 2 weeks during the time that you're engaged, and it's usually while being chaperoned or in your family's house for the Sabbath, for instance, or something like that. It's very important to realize that religions are very internally diverse. Different communities act differently, so you can't really generalize on the basis of one community because even the same community in a different country would have different customs. So that's very important to take into consideration when looking at things like that. So the third highlight that I would like to address today is the scene where Esti is trying to order coffee, but she doesn't know how to order coffee.
Coffee.
Flat white, cappuccino.
Just coffee.
I think it's a brilliant scene because it's summarized in such a short moment. Everything, I mean everything about what it's like to grow up ultra-Orthodox. So I remember the first time I was ordering coffee in our version of Starbucks that we have here in Israel. It's called Aroma, and I was going up to the cashier and trying to figure out how to order coffee. And the reason why it's so complicated to order coffee is because the whole culture around eating out in the ultra-Orthodox community is as follows. And again, this varies around different communities. So in the US, in some communities, it's very different, but I will tell you how it is in the city where I grew up in. So in the town where I grew up, you aren't allowed to eat out. So if you have, let's say, a pizza store, you can buy a pizza in a box and then you can take it home and eat it at home. Basically, pizza shops or sandwich stores or delis or whatever you call them aren't really allowed to have chairs on the street like you would have in Tel Aviv or in Paris. And that is because the Talmud refers to people who eat on the street as dogs, and it basically says that a person who is eating on the streets is so inhuman that you can't even accept that person's testimony in a court. So if you're seen eating on the street, your testimony won't be qualified in a Jewish court. And I'm talking about a religious Jewish court. In the Israeli court, it's a secular court. So we're talking about a religious Jewish court. And that point was drilled into me since a very young age. And if you had to eat a sandwich on a field trip, usually your school would find an area that is dedicated for eating. Like, we won't just be eating on the go. Like, there isn't that culture. So people aren't used to just going to a coffee shop and ordering coffee on the way to work. It's not something that you do. You don't order coffee on the way to school. And I did go to restaurants with my family. Again, like, I don't think in Esti's community it would be appropriate, but in my community it was, kind of. But we would go into restaurants that were closed. Like, they weren't on the street. Like, we never ate on the street. The idea of eating outdoors is very foreign to the way I was brought up. Since it's so foreign to the culture, like, the first time you are trying to order coffee or a drink in Starbucks or whatever it is in your country, you get paralyzed and you really don't know what to order. Like, coffee is just coffee, the kind of coffee you make at home, right? Like, what's the different kinds and what does it even mean? And even until today, like, I don't really know the differences. Usually I just order hot chocolate because I'm a hot chocolate type of person. The fourth highlight that I would like to bring up from the first episode is the whole thing of not being allowed to play instruments. Now, this is very weird for me because in the city where I grew up, which is an ultra-Orthodox city, girls play instruments. It's one of the only leisure activities that we're allowed to have. So I grew up playing the piano. I'm not sure if I can do it anymore, but I used to be able to do that. And it's very weird for me that it was like a key point of the series that she's not allowed to play instruments. But I said, religions are internally diverse. So maybe in that specific American Satmar community, girls weren't allowed to play the instruments. But what I assume that happened while writing that key point in the series is that the identity of the music teacher is more important than her playing the instrument. What I'm trying to say is that the community doesn't like it when you're learning from people that are not part of the community. Having external influence is bad. So even if you go and learn to play the piano, you would have to do that from someone who is a member of the community. So my piano teacher was a lady that lived next door. She was extremely religious. She was extremely nice. I loved studying with her, and I learned at her house. Like, I would just go to her house and learn how to play the piano. I think in the series, what the point that they were trying to make that was accurate is that Esti was studying from a Gentile lady, and that was a very big deal. So they keep referring to her music teacher as the shikse, which is a derogatory word for Gentile lady. And that is what was so bad about Esti's piano interests, I guess. Now, the fifth and the last point that I would like to highlight from the first episode is the scene where we see Esti swimming in the lake. Now, this was a very moving scene for me for several reasons. I mean, there is the whole symbolism of being baptized, which is also a Jewish tradition. Jewish women have to go to the mikveh, which is a Jewish ritual bath, once a month and get pure for their husbands. A whole thing. If you want to hear more about it, put a comment down and I will try to make a video about that. But generally speaking, going swimming is a very complicated concept for an ultra-Orthodox girl. Growing up as an ultra-Orthodox girl, I was taught that I had to be modest at all times. That included going swimming, and that included going to the beach. So whenever we went swimming in a swimming pool, we would go to a gender-segregated swimming pool, obviously, and we would also wear a shirt over our swimming clothes in order to be modest. When we went to the beach, it was even more complicated because usually you had a male lifeguard. So I was very religious growing up, and I believed most of the laws and rules, as I specified before. So even though my family didn't demand it from me, I would still go to the beach with socks and with a long dressing robe over my clothes. And the thought of being naked in the beach was extremely weird for me. Even today, when I go to the beach, I would wear shorts and a t-shirt or a tank top because I feel very awkward being exposed in public. So I also feel like that scene wasn't only extremely accurate, it was also something that so many of my friends related to, and it's like one of those little things that you experience being an ultra-Orthodox woman and living your life. Like, you're used to going into the water dressed if it's at the beach. Like, even the fact that she's taking off her stocking when she goes into the lake is like she's rebelling, you know? She's trying to be as the least modest as she feels comfortable, and it takes time. It really takes time to break into Western clothes, I would call it. So these were my 5 highlights of the first episode of Unorthodox. If you liked it and you want to hear more about being ex-Orthodox, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you would get notifications the next time I upload a new video. I'm gonna try to upload a video every Thursday, so hopefully, with the help of the mighty noodle, hopefully I'm gonna be able to stick to that schedule. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time. Bye! Meow!